Welcome to Love and Life. I'm Dr. Karen Anderson-Abril here with my co-host,
Pastor Elliot Anderson.
And Love and Life is your place to hear conversations grounded in psych research, psychotherapy,
and biblical truth
to help us thrive in love and life. We are back with one of Love and Life's all-time favorite guests, Dave Wayne, who is a psychiatric nurse who came by that profession with the best of intentions to help people, to help patients who are struggling with mental illnesses and mental challenges and emotional well-being. And as most folks in the psychiatric realm of the field, found himself being in a place where it was medication as first and primary protocol for his patients. We've talked about that part of Dave's experience and his history extensively in other podcast episodes. So we would love to invite you to hear more about that if you're interested in, and we'll put in the prior episodes in the show notes. But today we've asked Dave to come and speak to something with our new series on It's Just a Blank. And because those of us who are becoming more and more aware of, I want to put it more measured than I normally would. I typically would call us a pharma cartel run country. Okay, so let's put that aside because that's going to be polarizing for someone. I want to be more measured with this. So as we become more aware of the powers that be throughout our government, knowing that our Congress people and senators are funded by big businesses, and one of those big businesses is pharma. That's just a fact. And when we start thinking about this, we start looking over the history of our lives as regular human beings, just getting along and having a sickness here or an illness there or having a mental condition here. And we think about the drugs that we might and the medicines that we might take thinking, oh, it's just an aspirin. It's just an ibuprofen. It's just an antibiotic is what we spoke about in the first iteration of this series. And we've asked Dave to come and talk about something that I think is very common now for someone to say, oh, it's just an antidepressant. It's just an SSRI. No big deal. GPs, they're able to prescribe them. You don't even have to go to a psychiatrist. And if you look at the protocol again, or treatment plans for people who are from anything from grieving because someone that they love died, or going through a stressful life change or a loss like a job loss or moving or anything that would cause someone to have a bit of a season of I'm not feeling 100% enthusiastic and joyful every moment of the day. It's very common for someone to go, well, just go on an SSRI for a while. And so this series is going to question, is that really always the right choice? And does the general public, do we have informed consent about what these just take A, B, C, D, E, in this case, SSRI, just taking that, what is that inviting into your life that you really probably won't know, especially because we found over the last 5 years for sure, and certainly even before then, that oftentimes informed consent, though it is part of the Hippocratic Oath of doctors, it's not always happening. Dave, what do you think of when you think of, through your history as a psychiatric nurse, and now in the more holistic realm of your profession, what do you think of when someone goes, well, it's just an SSRI?
I think that they are buying into a very carefully crafted narrative that says that these medications are safe and effective, these are happy pills, and that doesn't actually have a supporting evidence base, that when you actually dig into the evidence that supposedly supports the use of these medications, the claim that it's safe and the claim that it's effective, both of those are completely contradicted by the studies that got these drugs on the market.
And that right there is something I just don't think someone who is just average American, just living their life, busy raising their kids, busy at their job, paying their mortgages, I don't think they know that. I think they think the FDA approved it, so they must be fine. And so we're going to talk about the FDA approval process a little bit because, again, I don't think that's something average people know. Nor why would they? They trust these government agencies to do their job so they can focus on their profession, whether they are a pipe fitter or whether they're a business owner, they've got their own stuff to deal with. So we've outsourced this expertise to these governmental agencies that we trust. We think that they're out there to support and protect us. So let's start with the beginning that you alluded to, the idea of an SSRI. So again, for someone who's not in our field, they wouldn't know what that even stands for. It's an antidepressant, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. The idea, just a quick and dirty understanding of neural pathways. We have one neuron, it's sending a message in the form of a neurotransmitter, as a chemical reaction, essentially, one neuron to another neuron. In between is what we call the synaptic cleft or the synapse. And the idea is that we're sending the serotonin, which is, again, research has shown is related to mood and feeling good. And so we're moving that from one neuron to another neuron. And the reuptake inhibitor, so the receiving neuron is going to block the uptake of this chemical transmission. And then we're going to have more serotonin hanging out in the synapse. Again, this gets even more complicated than we need to, but that is the idea. And it was based on, as you said, an understanding of neurology and how that affects our emotional state that suggested that there's a chemical imbalance, the chemical imbalance theory. And your it's not your fault you're feeling sad. It's not your fault you're depressed. It's just that you have a broken brain and your chemical interactions within your brain aren't functioning appropriately. So then this becomes, as you spoke to, a marketing tool to say, hey, sad person, there's nothing you need to do or change except take a pill and it's going to fix this broken process in your brain. Speak to that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this hypothesis came out of the 1950s with the first generation psych meds, which included antipsychotics and antidepressants. And they knew that they did something. They knew that antipsychotics somehow disrupted the dopaminergic system, and they knew that these antidepressants somehow disrupted the serotonergic system. And so the hypothesis at that time was, well, mood and happiness are based on serotonin, and so depression must be a chemical imbalance of serotonin. And they have spent the last 3/4 of a century trying to validate that hypothesis through every means imaginable of measuring serotonin. They've looked at all sorts of different metabolites. They've looked at cadaver studies. They've done different brain imaging. And we have learned an enormous amount about serotonin in the time since then. For one thing, about 90% of our serotonin is actually in our gut. So it is an incredible oversimplification to label this neurotransmitter as the happy chemical. That was just effective marketing, but that is really minimizes the incredibly complex role that serotonin plays in all sorts of different body systems. And you get a sense of this when you look at the side effect profile of antidepressants, because the side effects can be with your liver, they can be with your skin, they can obviously be neurological, they can be sexual, they can be GI. And that's because serotonin moderates activities in every single organ and body system that we have. So we were sold, it was marketing. It was marketing from the beginning when they started to allow drug manufacturers to advertise on TV back in the 90s. Some of the very first ads we saw said, hey, depression's caused by a chemical imbalance, and this is the happy chemical. And there was absolutely no evidence base for that at the time those commercials were made. They had been looking for that connection for decades and decades at that point, and they had zero evidence to suggest that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance of low serotonin.
And that's troubling too. And you and I have spoken about this, and Elliot, as my co-host, he's also mentioned this before. But again, the average American wouldn't know that we are one of only 2 countries in the world that allows direct-to-consumer marketing for pharmaceuticals. So these marketing campaigns have, in fact, influenced the public perception and understanding, such that I think the average American now, since the 90s, like you said, I think this was under 1996 under Bill Clinton, I believe, where we now are allowed to have Eli Lilly say, hey, you're feeling down, not your fault, not something you could do. I mean, don't worry about like getting exercise or getting vitamin D or changing your diet or working on some of your thought patterns that are keeping you in a very depressed mood because your stinking thinking it's affecting your emotions, which is all clearly evidenced through cognitive behavioral therapy research. No. It's just that you have the serotogenic, to your point, problem in your brain, and we've got a cure for you. The average American, I think, would say most people who are depressed, they need their happy pills because their brain is just faulty. And that's just the way, bodies, they break down and they have problems. So it's been a very effective marketing campaign. And yet recently, and even before that, I want to say, if you talk to psychiatrists who are truth tellers, and I don't even mean radical dissidents who are super anti-pharma, not even those folks. But for example, Dr. Alan Francis, who is the author of Saving Normal, who I had the honor of interviewing years ago on the podcast, he was the chair of the steering committee for the DSM-4. Now we're at the 5, what is it, TR or something? That's the second iteration of the 5. But meaning that he was in charge of deciding what is a disorder, what isn't, what's normal, what's not. Even he has come out with his book saying we are to the point where we're medicalizing every fluctuation of emotional state. And that, I think it was, you tell me, Dave, was it the 4 where they removed the grief? I can't remember the name of it now. The grieving, basically to say you couldn't be diagnosed with clinical depression if you'd experienced the loss of a loved one, a husband, wife, child, parent, sister, brother, anyone who you cared about who had died. You could not give someone a diagnosis of clinical depression because, of course, they're depressed. They are the grief exemption. That's what's called.
Yeah.
And I can't remember which, but it was recent. Which again, to Dr. Francis's point, how are you saying someone is responding abnormally to death when they are sad? I mean, this blows my mind. No, just take some Prozac. You'll feel better. You shouldn't feel better because you are grieving a profound loss. And so just to segue into another element that I knew I wanted to share with you, which you also know as well, but I want to share with our community, is that honest psychiatrists have known for a long time that what you said is in fact true. It's a marketing campaign that was very effective. The whole serotonin chemical imbalance theory. And in fact, in 2022, Joanna Moncrief did an umbrella study, which looks at all the available research that you spoke to before, all the different trials and studies to substantiate that, yes, it's serotonin levels, that's the problem. And she found what, again, these honest psychiatrists would have admitted even 30 years ago. There was never any evidence for this. She came out with a paper. She's actually coming out with a book. I can't remember if it's coming out yet or if it's in the fall. And she got so much pushback about this because she's basically saying, listen, she's a psychiatrist, or she's definitely a medical doctor. I don't know if she's a psychiatrist. I think, yeah, she is. I heard her interviewed recently. And she's saying, I'm not anti-drug. I'm just saying don't lie to people and tell them that the reason for their emotional state is because of a chemical imbalance when there is literally no evidence to substantiate that. And she got so much pushback, Dave, when she's just like, I'm a scientist. I'm looking at the data. I'm interpreting the data as any rational human scientist would. And why am I getting pushback?
Yeah, exactly. Seeing the reaction to the Moncrief study, it wasn't even like this was new information. She didn't conduct the science herself. All she did was go back decades and decades and look at everything else that had been published by everyone else about the link between serotonin and depression. And then she just publishes the results, and they were very inconvenient for the people who are selling antidepressants and for the people who are prescribing them, because they are very, very invested in that belief system. They're seeing all these patients in their practice, and they're giving them these medications, and they're telling them this is going to help with the chemical imbalance that's causing your depression. And Joanna Moncrief comes out with this umbrella review that essentially debunks that. And what's so unreal about it, Karen, is it's not like there's a body of evidence on one side that validates the serotonin hypothesis of depression, and a body of evidence on the other side that says, this isn't validated. There's never been a body of evidence that validates the serotonin theory of depression. It doesn't exist. So all these people who are clinging so tenaciously to that narrative, what are they clinging to? They're clinging to a lie. They're clinging to marketing, and the truth is right in front of them. And it's hard to understand the resistance that they have. Like how it's something I've really struggled with over the past, about 10 years since I became aware of this, because I used to tell my patients when they would be starting an antidepressant, hey, this is, an SSRI. This is going to help with the chemical imbalance that's driving your depression, and you'll probably need to be on it for the rest of your life, that sort of thing. And I do have to admit, it was incredibly painful to give up that worldview. It shatters your entire belief system, kind of, because when you buy into these organizations, and when you buy into these power structures, and when you buy into these narratives that says you can trust doctors, and you can trust the FDA, and you can trust the judicial system to punish people who hurt people with lies and propaganda and marketing, having to give up on all that is very, very distressing. But we see these people in the psychiatric establishment just clinging tenaciously to this narrative, even though the evidence is right in front of them that what they're doing is not safe and it's not effective.
Yeah. And I want to read right from, actually, I pulled this from Wikipedia, which I wouldn't recommend typically because I know that
yeah.
I'll leave that alone. But I know a lot of people would feel very comfortable with a Wikipedia entry as gospel truth. I personally wouldn't. But in this case, I think this portion is pretty spot on. And it's just a little paragraph here. Together with Mark Horowitz in 2022, Moncrief conducted the first systematic umbrella review of the evidence for the serotonin chemical imbalance theory of depression, which found that, quote, there is no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity. The research has been called, quote, important and also, quote, the most comprehensive rebuttal to date. According to critics of Moncrief, the conclusions of the paper are well-founded but obvious because the serotonin theory has not been viewed as serious for a while. General public didn't know that. Okay, that's my sidebar. And then finally, one more sentence. Moncrief believes that depression should be seen as a mood state rather than an illness, and argues that it's a largely normal reaction to adverse circumstances, which some people are more prone to than others. There's so many places we could go with this, but just to get back to the pushback that I was struck, again, I was just doing a little review to prepare for this conversation. And Rolling Stone magazine, which in our generation would have been like this very edgy and very left wing, and to the extent that they ever made any commentary on anything that wasn't music, which they did a lot, culture, politics, it was always coming from a very left wing mindset, and that's fine. They were like, we're counterculture, we're anti-establishment. And yet here, when the study came out, here was their response, which I thought was very interesting. Here's the title of an article. Who is the psychiatrist behind the antidepressant study taking over right-wing media? Joanna Moncrief has spent 2 decades questioning the efficacy of SSRIs. And more recently, she's gone after COVID-19 mandates. So that's another entirely different conversation, although it's related. But I was in shock to see that now the most radical left-wing thing you can do is to side with pharma and big business and big corporations, as opposed to going holistic and looking at alternative natural herbs and Chinese medicines and Chinese practices and health food. I mean, when did the left wing cozy up with big business? That was, in our generation, that was what the left wing would accuse the right wing of.
Yeah, I mean, just over the course of my lifetime, we've seen the Democrat Party and the progressives do a complete 180 on so many things. I mean, you go back to the 90s and early 2000s, and it was the Democrat Party who was against illegal immigration. They were the anti-censorship party, and now they've
For
changed
sure.
into the pro-censorship party. They've obviously changed into the pro-immigration party. They used to be very skeptical about authority and about institutions like the FBI and CIA, and they've done a complete 180 on that. And also skepticism about pharmaceutical companies and the medical industrial complex and the military industrial complex. They've also done a complete 180 on those topics as well. And I think that the biggest flip in terms of their skepticism towards the medical industrial complex came with the Affordable Care Act, also
Hmm.
called Obamacare. In order to get that passed, there were a lot of Democrats in Washington who cozied up to pharma. Pharma has an incredible budget for lobbying and for political donations. We are kind of sold this narrative, there's that word again, that
Hmm.
pharma spends all this money on research and development. They spend way more on lobbying and advertising than they actually spend on research and development. And we see the fruits of that spending now.
This is probably a good time to get into the FDA process. This is something that blew my mind when I started researching this. And I would love to hear what you have found in your studies and what you can add to what I know now, which is to me terrifying. And this, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is for any drug. But of course, as a psychologist, I'm focusing on psychotropics. So, in order to get a drug approved by the FDA, you need only 2 studies to show its effectiveness. You, as the pharmaceutical corporation, can fund those studies. I believe there must be some process in place that would try to have some objectivity. And you, again, can connect me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that there are entities that is their job, is we test drugs, and supposedly it's double blind, and supposedly even though pharma is funding this research, they can't get in there and start monkeying with the data, I'm assuming. But my concern is too, and this is what I've seen bringing us back to SSRIs, these studies can be constructed in such a way that you can go, oh, just 2 weeks, see what the effects are after 2 weeks and call it a day. Oh, it was fine. After 2 weeks, no one had any problems. So it's safe and effective. And yet people are prescribed such drugs for years. I know that in particular, Xanax, one of the studies I saw, only followed the participants for maybe 2 months. And they found that, yes, their anxiety decreased. And if you look at someone on Xanax, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, for 2 months, they in fact do show reduced anxiety. But once you get past a 2-month mark, then their anxiety tends to start increasing again, such that by the time they're on Xanax for a couple months, which most people are, they're not on it for just a day or two, they're on it for a couple months, and then they are in fact more anxious. And drugs like Xanax, and again, let's get back to the SSRIs, they are, and this is no informed consent on this, they are incredibly difficult to taper off should you decide you want to get off these drugs. And again, the initial studies to approve them never showed those long-term effects and what was going to happen when someone's been on this for 10 years and then trying to get off.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I remember when I first heard the term big pharma used
Yeah.
as kind of a slur, I thought it
Hmm.
sounded kind of conspiratorial because I did
For
not
sure.
think it was possible for, the thousands of people that work at Merck or Pfizer or wherever to all be in on this conspiracy to lie about the safety and efficacy of a drug. I thought maybe they fudged some numbers here and there, but as my career has advanced and as I've gotten to understand these things more thoroughly, everything is fragmented and everybody has their little piece of the puzzle. So when we talk about these clinical trials and we talk about how Pfizer does clinical trials and Merck does clinical trials, they outsource a lot of that. They outsource that to small companies who specialize in doing clinical trials. And how do you stay in business if you are one of those companies? You do not stay in
Mm,
business if you return negative results. So they are incentivized to give their the company who's funding them the results that they want.
right.
And this goes back decades and decades and decades. And they, like you said, it only takes 2 trials to get FDA approval. I remember being at a nursing conference once. It was American Psychopharmacology Association conference. That's what it's kind of called as a joke. It's the APA, but
I thought you were serious. I was like, yeah, they probably have such an organization.
it's the American Psychiatric Association, but it's basically the American Psychopharmac. Okay, so one of the presenters there talked about he wanted to read these studies that he kept seeing references to. He kept seeing references to this study and that study that showed that this antidepressant was effective, but he couldn't find the study texts themselves. He ended up having to FOIA the FDA to get the results of those studies. So this is a doctor who is prescribing these meds to patients, and he doesn't even have access to the data without submitting a FOIA request, which just right off the bat is bonkers. But then what he found out as he started to chase this topic is that when that SSRI was approved by the FDA, they submitted 7 studies, of which only 2 were positive. So they submitted 5 negative studies, 2 positive studies, and got it approved on the basis of the 2 positive studies. It's mind-blowing. Like, how is this our system? How is this evidence-based practice? How does this even get approved? But they have these FDA advisory panels, they have these review boards, and they're just completely captured. They're just completely captured. They are so conflicted. Even when members of these review boards are directly paid by the pharmaceutical companies who have a product on their docket, they don't recuse themselves. It's just completely corrupt. It's completely broken. And it's just been allowed. People have had the blinders on for decades and decades. This isn't a new problem. This goes back, unfortunately, it goes back a really, really long time. It's been par for the course for forever. So,
which is why a stat I came across recently, roughly a third of FDA approved medicines end up getting yanked later because they are, in fact, not even benign, like not even safe, not effective, but causing harm. And we can go back to Vioxx. We can go back to the fact that Pfizer itself would have had a $3.2 billion payout at one point for a drug that they marketed inaccurately. It was causing harm. And I don't remember which medicine it was that you might remember.
Which company was it?
Pfizer had the largest lawsuit, largest settlement ever in the history of, I don't even know if it was business or pharma, but one of the two, and it was $3.2 billion.
I think it was, yeah. So I think it was for off-label promotions of Lyrica, gabapentin, and there were a few others that they were promoting for off-label uses that had no evidence base. And yeah.
So, no, go ahead.
It's when you look at the records for criminal fraud and racketeering, it's just a who's who list of different pharmaceutical companies who are constantly playing leapfrog with each other. But do not mistake that for getting a sense that justice is being done and that these companies are being well policed, because when you look at these pharmaceutical settlements, justice is not being done. You might think, oh, they were fined a few $1 billion. Obviously, justice has been served because they lost this huge class action lawsuit. But that is absolutely not the case. Everybody's familiar with OxyContin. There are a ton of documentaries out there about that, so we won't even touch that one. Let's look at Vioxx, though, since that's a little less known. With Vioxx, you had them conduct clinical trials. Early clinical trials assessed that there was a cardiac side effect of Vioxx that was going to kill people. They then designed further clinical trials in order to intentionally hide that side effect in order to get FDA approval. The FDA approved Vioxx. It was on the market for 4 years. Eventually, it was pulled off the market after the pile of bodies was at something like 60,000 people. And yes, Merck lost several large class action lawsuits. They were fined billions of dollars, but it wasn't more than their profits. And worse than that, nobody went to prison. The people involved in doing that, the people who exchanged emails where they were outlining how they were going to design a clinical trial to hide cardiac side effects, they got promoted. They're out there today. One of them is on a board at Harvard today as we speak. He just won an award for being an amazing businessman. One of them is a CEO of a different pharma company now. All these people who are involved in these scandals, you might think, well, they were fined billions of dollars. The people involved weren't fined. The company was fined, and it was less than their profits. The people involved got promoted for doing that. And that's how our system works. It's not just a failure of the pharmaceutical companies. It's not just that they have business models based on fraud. It's also a failure of the regulators. They have been abysmal, and they've been doing the exact opposite of what they're supposed to do. And it's a failure of the judicial system as well. The judicial system is also a complete failure because it does not hold these absolute ghouls accountable, even when the body count is in the tens of thousands of people. Nobody goes to prison. And that's why this system never changes. It's widespread systemic failure amongst all these systems.
Well, the fine is just the cost of doing business. It's just factored into the R&D. There's going to be some fines because we're gonna mess with the clinical trials such that we can hide whatever we need to hide. And there's thousands of people die. So what? We still made our billions. Oh, and what? They paid $3.2 billion. Well, I don't, not for Vioxx, but for the other drugs we were talking about. But then, but if they made $30 billion,
right?
Still pretty good return.
Yeah.
And to your point about the regulators and the FDA not regulating, they are the ones who, when they sit on the FDA board and they're approving these drugs, they get cushy board positions, and it's a revolving door. You can see charts and memes where people show, who's the one recently? Scott
Gottlieb.
Thank you.
Scott Gottlieb.
Yeah. Isn't he, which board does he sit on now? He was there during COVID.
He's on Pfizer's board. Yeah. So,
perfect.
So he left, he was chairman at the FDA, left to join Pfizer's board. And then he was on TV all throughout 2021. He was on MSNBC and CNN and the whole list of them. And he was pushing the Pfizer COVID vaccine. And they would always introduce him as the former FDA chairperson, Scott Gottlieb, instead of the current FDA board member, Scott Gottlieb. So those mainstream media networks are complicit with all this as well. And it's because their number one source of revenue is advertising. And who's their number one advertiser? It's pharma. You see all these pharma ads, not just because they're trying to sell drugs. The real goal of all these pharma ads that are on network TV is to buy silence, because you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. And it's their number one source of revenue. Like, pharma keeps the lights on at MSNBC and CNN and Fox and a lot of them, because they get most of their revenue from advertisements, and pharma is their biggest advertiser.
Yeah, and any of their talking heads making $30 million a year, what is their incentive to go, let's do an expose on pharma? Not going to happen, or else I won't be making $30 million next year.
Yeah, exactly.
A few years ago, I started having trouble falling asleep, and I started taking melatonin because I thought it was a natural way to try to relax myself, calm myself down, and go to sleep. But it turns out that as a hormone supplement, melatonin can disrupt our other hormones, and we can build up an immunity to it. So when we started partnering with the wellness company, I was super excited to try their melatonin-free sleep aid called Restful Sleep. It includes passion flower, chamomile, valerian root, among other herbs, and natural ways to help calm us down and get us ready to go to bed. I've been using it for a couple months now, and Restful Sleep helps my mind and body quiet themselves and ease into sleep. If you've ever had insomnia, you know how brutal it is. The wellness company's Restful Sleep can help. Head over to twc.health/lovelife and enter promo code LOVELIFE at checkout for 15% off your entire order. That's twc.health/lovelife and promo code LOVELIFE for 15% off your entire order.
So let's bring it back to SSRIs.
Yes.
We might have someone say, well, Karen and Dave, fine, you don't like these drugs. You're questioning the entire messaging the entire premise upon which they are supposed to work. You are taking issue with the approval process. You are looking at pharma's influence on our government officials and our media. You're making all these points, but I mean, I've had no problems. I've been on my happy pills for the last 5 years, and I think they helped me. And in fact, my friend she was really losing it, and she thinks her Prozac saved her life. So what's your problem? Why are you trying to take away something that's really helped me? You're a jerk, Dave. Karen is a freak with her anti-pharma stance, I swear, because we have one conversation with Karen where she doesn't bring up pharma. Probably not. That's a sidebar. But what do we say to folks like that? Because there are people who will say that like, this
Absolutely,
was really helpful for me. And what's your problem? Don't take it if you don't want it, Dave, but leave me alone.
Oh, to be clear, I've talked to a lot of people who have said that in my practice as a nurse in an inpatient psychiatric setting. I've talked to a multitude of people who would swear that antidepressants saved their life. And that experience is completely valid. And I'm so happy for them that these medications helped them. It comes down to an issue of informed consent, though. People need to be told what the actual risk-benefit analysis is of SSRIs before they start them so that they can make an informed decision. For example, one of the things that people might be told is that SSRIs are sometimes court-ordered to be given to sex offenders because they are so good at stifling somebody's libido and causing sexual dysfunction. So when you look at the evidence base for SSRIs, they are far more effective at causing sexual dysfunction than they are at treating depression. And that's not coming from sources that are right-wing sources. That's not coming from the fringe. That's not coming from the anti-psychiatry movement. That's coming right from the largest analysis of studies that come from the pharmaceutical companies themselves. There's a clinician tool. It's called UpToDate. You already mentioned how the vast majority of the time an antidepressant is prescribed. It's not prescribed by a psychiatrist. It's prescribed by, a family medicine nurse practitioner or a PA or a family medicine doctor. Like, these are the people that people tend to see. It's so hard to get in to see a psychiatrist or an actual mental health specialist. We have something like 50 million antidepressant prescriptions floating around in the US at this point in time, and they tend to come from just general medicine practitioners. They're not coming from specialists. So the tool that is most often used by people in general practice is called UpToDate. This is a clinician tool that's used at something like 90% of academic institutions, such as hospitals throughout the country. It's used about 1.6 million times per day. So this is a doctor's go-to tool when they're trying to figure out how to treat somebody, what to prescribe, that sort of thing. And it collects all the latest and greatest evidence and synthesizes it into a format that doctors can reference to make clinical decisions. And so I was browsing through it recently, looking at what it happens to say about SSRIs. And this is it's another one of those conspiracies that's hidden right in plain sight, Dr. Karen, because it says that the number needed to treat is about 7 to 8 people, meaning that you have to give an SSRI to about 8 people for one of them to experience a benefit. It talks about the placebo effect. So when you look at the aggregate of studies supporting the use of SSRIs, they're effective about 53% of the time on average. And about 40% of that is the placebo effect, meaning the drug effect is only about 13% of the efficacy of an SSRI. Meaning when people say, hey, my antidepressant helped me, it's about a 13% chance it was actually the antidepressant that helped them. Now get this, because it gets worse. That 13% comes from studies that are deemed to have high to moderate bias and low to moderate quality. That is the exact opposite of what you want. When they went to synthesize all this data, they found that the pharmaceutical companies would just refuse to release them patient level data, and they would refuse to give them the negative studies. So they know that they're working with a biased evidence base. Even with all that bias, even with that lack of rigor, even with the low quality, the best data we have suggests that antidepressants are about 13% effective on average. And when you look at things like side effects, suicidality is one, harm to self and others. We know they have a black box warning that they increase suicidality. And then the sexual side effects are something like 50 to 80% prevalent. I actually think it's a lot higher than that. And what people aren't told, going back to that topic of informed consent, is that the sexual side effects of antidepressants for some people are permanent. At this point, I've talked to a multitude of people that were on SSRIs for a very short amount of time, like weeks, and they experienced profound sexual side effects, so they stopped taking them. And years later, those side effects have not gone away. We would not have 50 some million people in this country on antidepressants if they were actually given informed consent. Who's going to start a drug where you're told, like, hey, there's a 50 to 80% chance this is going to have profound sexual side effects on you that might never go away, and there's only a 13% chance that this drug is actually going to help your depression. If it doesn't help your depression, it puts you at risk of suicide, because we know that these drugs actually incite suicide in people through side effects like akathisia and derealization and depersonalization. So again, it's like the conspiracy that's hidden in plain sight. You dive into the evidence, and not the fringe evidence, not the right-wing people, they would label them like these are the studies from the drug companies themselves who are selling these medications. And their evidence is that they do far more harm than good. But here we are.
And I'm so glad you brought that up about the sexual side effects, because since the beginning, we've known that low libido is a side effect, which right there in and of itself is not going to make you happier if you're not wanting to have sex. We know that orgasms provide endorphin rushes. I mean, all kinds of things that are, especially if you're having relationship problems, you want that sexual connection to be strong and nurturing the bond between two people, between a couple. But I just recently heard what you had just shared, that these can be permanent. I think about some little 14-year-old girl who's going through her adolescent troubles, middle school mean girl stuff, gets put on an SSRI. Now she's 24, getting ready to get married, and she's having sex for the first time. I mean, probably had sex earlier, but whatever. Having sex and going, what's the big deal? It's not, I'm not into it. What does this bode for her marriage? For the potential for her to have what most humans would say is one of the most beautiful experiences that God has given us, which is our sexual connection, the thrill of it, the intensity of it, to have that robbed from her. She will never have she'll never fathom what that is. And in the name of helping her? Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's not just that. It's that she's going to be blamed for that side effect. It's this blame the victim problem that psychiatry has as well, because this side effect isn't just unknown amongst the people taking the meds. The people prescribing them are largely unaware of just how profound the sexual side effects are. So this person ends up internalizing it. They end up blaming themselves. It's just like the diagnosis of treatment-resistant depression. So many people are getting this diagnosis lately, treatment-resistant depression. Why? Because they give them one of these absolute garbage medications that does more harm than good, and then it doesn't work for their depression. Is that the fault of the med? No, that's the fault of the patient. So we're going to give them another diagnosis. We're going to make it their fault that this garbage medication didn't help their depression. And these people end up going down this path. Let's take that young woman that you used as an example. Okay, let's say that she learns about the problems with antidepressants and wants to get off of it. Good luck finding a prescriber who is educated about how difficult it is to come off of an antidepressant. If she wants to have a baby and have that baby be unharmed by antidepressants, she needs to be off her medication. Antidepressants they hurt babies. Like, this is just known. This is just established. The evidence is in, the data is in. Babies should not be exposed to antidepressants. But if you're a woman who wants to become pregnant or is pregnant, good luck getting off it. It is incredibly difficult. And a lot of that difficulty has to do with the gaslighting done by ignorant prescribers who don't understand how difficult it is to get off of them.
Mm-hmm. And this is a nice time to remind people, again, they wouldn't know. I didn't even know. The first time I saw an ad for Abilify, because your Prozac isn't working, your SSRI isn't working, so you need a chaser drug. So if you're not given the treatment-resistant depression and then told it's your fault, you might be prescribed another drug that, Abilify, that sounds wonderful. I'm going to be able to do the things that I couldn't with my Prozac. Well, guess what? That's an antipsychotic. Does that not trouble anyone? An antipsychotic? You're sad because you're grieving, and we've gotten rid of the grieving exemption. So now you're sad, you're processing some trauma or some pain or some anything. And now, because your antidepressant was garbage in the first place, as you said, we're going to go ahead and throw an antipsychotic at you. You're not psychotic for having a human emotion.
Yeah, they're targeting a different neurotransmitter there. They're targeting the dopaminergic system, and it's been known for decades that antipsychotics cause metabolic dysfunction and shorten people's lives. They cause people to develop diabetes. They cause all sorts of profound side effects that shorten people's lives. That's another thing, though, that the pharma industrial complex has tried to hide from the public. There's a series of reporting. There's a book, and there were some New York Times articles back in the early 2000s by Alex Berenson called the Zyprexa Papers, where essentially a whistleblower involved in a lawsuit helped leak some of these documents that showed that these manufacturers were aware of and intentionally suppressing their knowledge about the metabolic dysfunction caused by antipsychotics that was shortening and worsening people's lives. So this goes back decades and decades. None of this is the problems we face in 2025 are not new. They've been practicing this game for a long, long, long time.
Dave, another not ever discussed side effect or consequence of using, again, just an antidepressant, just an SSRI. And please speak to this, because I don't know the exact number we're talking about, but there is a correlation between, I don't know even how prolonged you have to be on an SSRI and a bipolar 2 diagnosis, which I find very interesting, because when I was getting my master's in clinical psych back in the 90s, we did not talk about bipolar 2 the way we do now. It probably was still even manic depression at that point. And it was this very severe because of the highs and lows, the manic phases where you're not in touch with reality. So you're almost psychotic at that point, or you probably essentially are. And then those lows where you can't get out of bed for 2 weeks and you won't take a shower. That was a true, what we called a manic depression, a bipolar. Now this bipolar 2 is where, it's not that bad, but it's somewhere in between. You might have some erratic behavior here and there. And it kind of cropped up. It also cropped up in children, which is a conversation for another day, which I think it actually warrants one of our discussions. But I was wondering recently, and I'd love to hear what you think, might it be partly due? I mean, first of all, there's always a diagnosis du jour. So I don't even take these diagnoses all that seriously. Like, someone was telling me, my friend's bipolar. I'm like, sure. Okay, fine. That's just very convenient to label everything. And again, because if we have a diagnosis and we can prescribe a pill and so forth, what we've been talking about the entire conversation today. But is it possible that there are some more bipolar 2 diagnoses happening because of this connection to prolonged SSRI use?
Oh, absolutely. And I would say that that's very well established at this point. I think it's important to outline how, when we talk about how depression is not caused by low serotonin, that doesn't mean that these medications are benign. When we talk about the placebo effect, that doesn't mean that these medications are benign. They do act on the serotonergic system. They cause incredible disruption in the serotonergic system. So it's important to understand that depression is not caused by low serotonin, but these medications do cause enormous disruption in this infinitely complex system. And for some people, that manifests as a complete manic break where they are, like you said, psychotic. They are completely out of control. And I've seen people in this state, and it is incredibly dangerous and difficult for them. It's difficult and dangerous for everybody around them. You see people engaged in incredibly risky behaviors, such as all of a sudden they're gambling away the entire family's savings. All of a sudden they're engaged in incredibly risky sexual behavior. All of a sudden they're up for days at a time walking around on complex fractures because their ability to understand that they are severely injured has been that impaired. Like it's incredibly harmful to people. And this is something that did not exist to this extent at all compared to after these serotonergic disrupting medications hit the market. It was not nearly as prevalent as it is now. And it's not because, oh, we're better at spotting it now, we're better at diagnosing it now. No, it's not like back in the 1960s, we just didn't notice these people in full-blown manic episodes. You can't miss them.
Right. You know, as we wind down this conversation, I really want to get to the human element. And this is something that troubles me. And this is where the hair on my back goes up and I get defensive when people come for me, because I do. And we have friends in the field. And sometimes people look at me as like, they dismiss what I have to say because I think that I'm so anti-pharma at this point, which they're not wrong, but I'm coming from a place of love. And I know that it doesn't feel that way sometimes because I'm probably pretty combative in my tone, as I can be even when we get going. But it's because it breaks my heart that we have decided as a society that our first course of action is to dehumanize someone to the point that we tell them their feelings and their emotions are meaningless. It means nothing. It's nothing. Your reasonable, legitimate, understandable, rational human response to the difficulties and the profound losses that we incur in life, these are meaningless. So let's just pop a pill and put you on your way, which makes it worse. And you're talking about those 13% of the people who may be helped by an SSRI. You've already established that the studies that would maybe give that 13% of people that had a positive impact, those are cruddy studies for the most part. Like you said, the rigor's not there. Who knows what's going on actually if you start peeling away the layers of the data and the methodology and so forth and the sample that they pulled from, they chose for their participants. But I also think about the 13% of the people, maybe they reported, yeah, I feel better, because they're just numb. We've just told them, we can't handle your emotions. We can't handle you. We'll just numb you out. And I know you talked about this when we spoke the first time about your patients in the psych wards in the units with just zombies. Like, how dehumanizing. To me, it's so cruel. And I just hope that people hear, if they've gotten this far along with us today, that they hear that we're coming from a place of just deep empathy for humans and the human experience. And we do not want that to be labeled as just a broken brain. You're screwed up, instead of honoring their totally understandable response to whatever has come their way in life.
Karen, I have come to the conclusion that these medications are effective at severing people from their own humanity. So somebody might go on an antidepressant and then they have the incredibly profound experience of the birth of a child, and they don't feel joy. They don't feel anything. They have been numbed. They experience the death of a parent, and instead of grieving, they don't feel anything. The people that I've talked to that experienced permanent sexual dysfunction after taking an SSRI, it's not just a physical numbing. They also find that their personality has been changed, that they have been numbed in that regard as well. And so it affects their relationships, it affects their friendships, it affects their relationships to family members, it affects every aspect of their life. And like I said, it severs them from their own humanity, and they are just living in despair. And I'm glad that you brought it up, and that we would like to end on it, that we're not just saying like, we're not just screaming into the void about how awful these medications are. There are a lot of people out there who need help and need to be validated. And I think one of the biggest flaws, disappointments, and crimes of the current kind of psychiatric establishment is not recognizing the harm that's being done to these people. It's instead blaming them for the iatrogenic harm that psychiatry is doing to them with these medications.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel validated, just that we're not alone in this, and that I hope that people can hear our hearts and where we're coming from, and our deep belief in our fellow man, to be able to move through those seasons of darkness and those seasons, those valleys. And instead of doing that by separating from themselves and creating distance emotionally from those who love them, rather the opposite approach, coming together, connecting, supporting, praying for one another, finding community, finding common ground, finding people who have also walked that painful path and can validate their experience and increase the connection in humanity, instead of pulling ourselves apart due to these drugs of coursing through our veins. Dave, is there anything else that when you think of this topic, it's just an SSRI, it's just an antidepressant, that you would like to leave with the listeners?
I think we covered the important parts. We covered how the evidence base just isn't there. And I think it's always important to talk about PSSD as well, because that community is so misunderstood, is so ignored, is so unacknowledged by the psychiatric establishment. But they're out there, they exist, there's a lot of them, and it's inconvenient to study them. It's inconvenient to study things like how to safely taper off of psychiatric meds. And that's why the research isn't out there. That's why the attention isn't out there on those topics. But there are so many people who have had their eyes opened and are trying to forge a new path, and are trying to create resources for those people. There's a website called PSSD Network. There's a website called Surviving Antidepressants. There's a growing movement of extremely accredited clinicians and fantastic scientists and psychiatrists who are forging a better path ahead that actually doesn't rely on these incredibly damaging medications.
Yeah. Thanks again, Dave. I really appreciate your time and your expertise and your wisdom. And it's always a pleasure to connect with you.
I feel the same, Karen. It's always nice to talk to somebody who gets it, who, is there with you and sees the world in the same way. So thank you for the conversation.
Love and Life with Dr. Karen and Pastor Elliot is produced by Tim May and executive producer, Dr. Karen Anderson-Abel. For more information about Love and Life, please go to loveandlifemedia.com.